Welcome to today's Hyde Lecture. My name is Nate Bisak. I'm an assistant professor in interior design, and I have the pleasure this afternoon of introducing Amie Shao. Amie's a principal with Mass Design Group in Boston and manages a lot of their research work, with particular focus and themes on health infrastructure, patient-centric design, and infection control strategies in limited resource settings. Mass Design's group mission largely is to research, design, and advocate for architecture that promotes economic growth, social change, and justice. She leads impact research across Mass's work and has been involved in the design and evaluation of healthcare facilities in Haiti, Africa, and the US. Amie also leads Mass's immersive research, which employs user-centered practices and community engagement to guide innovative design proposals. Prior to joining Mass, Amie worked for OMA in Beijing, Work Architecture Company in New York, and In Situ in Panama. She received her Master's of Architecture and a certificate in Urban Policy and Planning from Princeton. Today, Amie is going to speak to us about the ways that Mass is expanding architectural practice through immersive contextual work that uncovers local needs and opportunities, impact-driven design that advocates the well-being and of people and communities, construction processes that amplify regional investment, and impact evaluation that captures the value of design and its effect on people's lives. Please join me in welcoming Amie Shao.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here. I'm from Iowa, so it's really nice to come to the Midwest and feel the horizon again. So Mass Design Group was founded on the premise that architecture is never neutral. Design is never neutral. It either helps or it hurts. Mass is based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Kigali, Rwanda. And as a nonprofit design collective, as Nathan mentioned, our mission is to research, build, advocate for design that promotes health, justice, and human dignity. Over the past 10 years, we've had the opportunity to work in something like 21 countries and built 20 projects. And we've been able to grow our team to over 100. And it's been a really great growing opportunity for all of us. And we recently opened our first US project in Montgomery, Alabama. It's called the Peace and Justice Memorial, which we designed for Brian Stevenson and his organization, the Equal Justice Initiative. Today, though, I would like to talk about some of the ways that we have been working to expand the expectations for architectural practice. And I'm going to present some projects in Haiti and Africa that frame a larger thesis around how design can be leveraged to improve the lives of individuals and communities. But then later I'm going to present some US-based healthcare research that looks more on the interior furniture design scale that demonstrates ways that we are pursuing impact-driven design across scales. So together, though, I thought I would start at the beginning. Our very first project in around 2008 was a hospital in Rwanda with Partners in Health, the global health organization led by Dr. Paul Farmer, who you see on the left, in collaboration with Dr. Agnès Binouahou, who is the Minister of Health in Rwanda. And Rwanda, here's where Rwanda is located for everybody who isn't familiar with the African continent. And within Rwanda, there was this one district up north called Butaro, and it was one of the more remote districts. And of a population of 400,000 people, there was not a single doctor. It was an incredible, beautiful, mountainous, volcanic landscape. And we are really excited to think about how we could help Dr. Farmer begin planning for this hospital. And the genesis story is that one of my colleagues, Michael Murphy, while he's in grad school, actually just attended a conference that Dr. Farmer was giving a presentation at, and afterwards approached him to say, you know, you're doing all of this really amazing work that is about improving people's lives. Please tell me what architects you're working with to build these facilities, to build housing, to build hospitals, which all contribute to this larger thesis around health and healing in the broadest sense of the word. And Paul replied, architects? I don't work with architects. I drew the last thing that we built on the back of a napkin. And so we began thinking about how, as architecture students, we could leverage our skill sets that we were gaining to help this organization who was doing great work but not really leveraging the power of design. And so when we began working with him, we were really inspired by this region and everything about the particulars of this place. But as we began looking more into what was appropriate in designing for this setting, we learned about a not so great example in South Africa. So Tugela Ferry, South Africa, was a lesson about the dangers of generic facility designs that are not tailored to place. And we realized that we had to think very carefully about airborne infection control. So in 2006 in Tugela Ferry, South Africa, there was an outbreak of extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis. And it was in a hospital that wasn't appropriately designed for the local climate or the local disease burden. So when the outbreak happened, people were coming in for things like broken legs and walking out with this disease, which you get through droplets in the air. And it was because they were waiting in these crowded, unventilated hallways. And most of the people who contracted this disease died from it. So we realized, every project has a mission. And to find that mission, you really need to get proximate to ask questions that you didn't know needed to be asked, and to seek solutions that are very specific to place. The design that we eventually came up with the partners that we were working with on the ground sought to create a contextually responsive hospital that would address airborne infection, but also offer dignified and high quality care in a region where there had, as I mentioned, not been a single doctor, and think about how we might embed healthcare into the local community. So if hallways were contributing to airborne infection, how could we leverage Rwanda's amazing temperate climate and do away with hallways? So we broke up the hospital into a series of smaller buildings that would form a campus of spaces. And we got rid of the interior hallways that were unventilated down the middle of buildings and had all of our main circulation on the exterior. And then when we started talking with caregivers and providers in this setting about what it actually meant to care for patients, we learned that individual patient rooms, which is the standard for kind of a high quality of care in the US, were actually, in this context, affiliated with higher risk and higher mortality because of the lack of staff oversight. So there weren't enough nurses to oversee all individual rooms. So we had to have a large open ward. And so we asked, how could we create an open ward that would still afford some privacy and some views and some quality of life, but also allow nurses to see everybody and do what they need to do. So we inverted the beds from a traditional nightingale arrangement, which is basically, if you picture a large box, the beds arrayed at the edge of the building looking in at one another. But if you think about that, that had made great strides in its day, and she had done so much research about spacing, and it was incredible. But for this particular context, in this particular climate, we had the opportunity to think about, what would be what you would want to look at if you were a sick patient? Probably not other sick patients. So we flipped that around. We put a half-height wall down the center, which would house all the medical gases and all the equipment and all the electricity, and we had the patients' beds turned the other way. And this allowed us to open up the perimeter walls to have larger windows for not only views, but natural ventilation. And we also thought deeply about how we could integrate the building into the landscape and into the community, and leverage local labor and craft and materials to create something that the community could feel was theirs. So the story behind this image is when we began looking at what was considered vernacular materials, if you asked somebody, they would say not a whole lot. And we began observing this volcanic stone littered around the fields, and it was quite a nuisance. So farmers would have to pick it up out of their fields and pile it off to one side. And when you looked at how it was being used in buildings, they were basically using it as the guts of a wall and then plastering it over with cement, because cement was a kind of status symbol. And we asked, what could we do with this? How could we make this something that would have value, that people would feel imbued a sense of localness, and create a craft and a skill that didn't exist? So we worked with stonemakers to try to get to the challenge of how can you design a kind of puzzle piece-like system of stones that would, the rule of thumb we gave them was be spaced less than 1 finger apart. And they started out, it was initially a little bit crude, and they eventually got to this really fine quality of work that they took a lot of pride in. And they began on this first building here, and when they got all the way around to where they started, they were able to see how much they had progressed, and they had so much pride in how far they'd come that they asked to take down the original wall and rebuild it. I think that's a really nice story about how you can think about craft in terms of not just how you want it to end up looking, but what you want it to mean to people and to place. So that project took a life of its own and led to some others. So once there was the hospital, then the next issue became, well, if you have this high quality, amazing hospital that's attracting a lot of patients, and the patient numbers are growing, what's next? Now, how do you attract the highest quality doctors to practice in a place as remote as this? So sub-Saharan Africa has 24% of the global disease burden, but only 3% of doctors. And so the next project that Partners in Health worked on with us was a doctors' housing program. So how can we design dignified, high-quality, beautiful houses that would help be an attraction for the best physicians to come to this area and work? We thought about also how we could leverage local craft to create things that were locally made inside and be Rwandan. Some images flipping through. This is a second phase, which the first houses were for doctors and their families, and the second phase was shared housing for more short-term staff. Some images on the hillside. And then after that, the next project was, now that all these people are coming for treatable and infectious diseases, what about the not infectious diseases? And one thing that's commonly not recognized is cancer is thought about as a first world disease or a kind of Western thing. But in fact, 70% of cancer cases are actually in limited resource settings. And so then the next project became, how can we think about what it would mean to build the first rural East African ambulatory cancer center on this same hilltop? And I won't go into too much of the design there, but essentially it was, how can you create a space where people can feel at peace while they're undergoing treatment and have these views out and feel a sense of respite and a sense of hope. So they had these big swinging doors that could open out into the countryside for views and for air. And then one project that we're currently building at the moment now is, then we needed housing for the cancer patients and their families to come and stay when they are coming for treatment. And then this took on an even bigger life when the Ministry of Health was so inspired by the story of Butaro and the momentum that had been created here, that they wanted to build the first what it's called the University of Global Health Equity, but it's a teaching hospital. And I think when you think back about the Genesis story, it's kind of incredible to think about what was once a hilltop with nothing and 0 doctors in this region, the power of architecture to create a place that people value, that creates this momentum for impact and momentum and a kind of groundwork for an organization like Partners in Health to be able to sustainably build and sustainably grow the work that they're able to do. So another thing that we've learned in our work has been this idea that, and I talked about it a little bit in the Butaro example, but this idea that to maximize impact, it's not only about the end result. It's not only about designing the building. It's about designing the process of building. So the project I want to talk through to that end is a very small primary school project that we did with the African Wildlife Foundation in rural Congo. So I think the best introduction to that, to give you a sense of what this place is and how far away it is, you have to take something like 3 planes and then a charter plane and then a motorcycle for 8 hours to get to the middle of jungle. It's very hard to reach. And the premise for a school, for something like a wildlife foundation, is something that might strike people as a little bit odd. But what the African Wildlife Foundation was trying to do was think more holistically about how they could get the communities to support wildlife conservation in this area. And they had to think about how they would establish a conservation covenant with these organizations as an exchange. And one of the ideas that really came to the forefront was the communities wanted schools and better education for their young ones. And so the idea of the school was to almost be a trade. In exchange for protecting the wildlife, the community would get this school, but also the school would be a place to think about developing a conservation curriculum to train the next generations. So I'll just play this video quickly. That gives you a little sense of the setting and to the degree to which this was made by hand. So this was an extremely pure architectural process in that 99% of everything of all the materials were procured on site. And by that I mean like within a mile of the site. And it was because of the extreme remoteness that we couldn't, for economic reasons, financial reasons, we couldn't bring things in, but also it didn't make sense to do that because the point of this school was to set a replicable model that others could expand upon in this area. And also you have the problem of, if you do something that's imported or something that isn't procured from this place, well, when AWF is no longer here on the ground, or when something happens, how will the community be able to repair the building? So we had to think deeply about leveraging all of the resources at hand, and so we identified some strands of sustainably harvestable local timber, and those were leveraged. Here's some images of the finished building, but those were leveraged into anything from the huge beams that support the building to all of these shingles on top to this kind of finer woodworking that was done for the furniture and the doors and other things. And so as I mentioned, it's really interesting to think about where everything comes from, and most of where everything comes from is very close, except for things like the metal and the steel. I guess steel is part of metal. But when you look back and take a step back and compare the Lima school to another school that we did, and then compare that to the global average for educational projects, the embodied carbon, which is the amount of carbon or energy that kind of lies within the building materials themselves and the process of construction. It's not the kind of operation side of the building, which in this case was also zero. It was 28 times less carbon per meter squared than the global average for school projects. What's interesting to think about as you design projects in this kind of setting is usually we try to minimize labor in projects to save money, especially here in places like in the US. In this case, we were trying to minimize the material costs because the materials that were coming from on site were free. You just dig them up or chop them down or however you procure them. And the things that we had to pay money for were imported, and we didn't want to do a lot of imported materials. We wanted the majority of the project to be labor costs because the goal was to leverage job creation and educational training as a way to build capacity in the local communities. And so the project not only invested a lot of money into the local economy, but created jobs for that community. 93% of the money was spent regionally and 74% of it was spent locally, even amongst the kind of imported materials that we had to bring in. I think this is a really nice story about, even when you think about the most small of projects, how can you establish a bold vision that makes a claim about what architecture can be and tries to push the bounds of what architecture can be. So this next project that I want to show is really responding to this idea that architects are often challenged about whether design is needed, or about whether design has impact, because it's very hard to prove. People often portray us as kind of causing more trouble than we're worth, or just artistic soul-seeking expression. In a world driven by bottom lines, the kind of financial equation, without data, it can be very hard to convince those with decision-making power to do better than the status quo. There's a lot of research in evidence-based design and things like that that do prove how small, discrete, provable interventions do have value. And that's things like within a patient room, if you rotate a sink X degrees, that will increase hand washing by this much. And that gets people to make those changes because it's like you can wrap your mind around it and it's easy to prove. But beyond those discrete interventions, we all know that there's a lot of things that really matter to things like healthcare that are really difficult to measure, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do that. We seek to measure our work in a few ways. So there are, when you think about what the mission of a project is, which is what is this building trying to do, what is it trying to change, and that's often aligned with the client's or the partner's mission, that is something that is project specific. But then we also measure the economic, environmental, or educational, or emotional, or equity impacts of our method or our process as an architect. So the example I'm going to talk about right now is kind of project specific. In 2013, we were approached by UNC Malawi and the Ministry of Health in Malawi to design a maternity waiting home in the Kasungu district. So in Malawi, maternal and infant health is a big problem, and the main issue is access to care. So it's a really rural region, it's a mountainous region, and women have a hard time accessing health facilities. So sometimes it's too much to even try to make it to a health facility, and sometimes something happens and they can't make it in time, and they give birth on the road on the way. And the idea behind maternity waiting homes is to provide a space for women to stay in the weeks prior to delivery. So it's almost like a home or a kind of hotel that is right next to a healthcare facility where they can safely be there when the time comes. They can pop over to the health facility. They're a very popular and increasingly popular intervention in a lot of developing countries and in the, rural areas, like even in the rural United States. But they really vary in success because sometimes they lack space, they lack ventilation, and they lack basic sanitation, basic comforts. And this was true in Malawi when we got there. So the standard government maternity waiting homes was essentially a barracks. It was a large, dark, unventilated, crowded building with 36 women stuffed inside. And the problem that we were faced with was, how can we encourage women to come and to stay until they give birth? And this is not it. So our challenge was how to rethink what the standard could be to increase utilization and create a positive experience for women coming from the remote villages. So from our immersion, our facility visits, our time spent speaking with mothers and caregivers and family, we were really inspired by the incredible social interaction that we saw going on. But it wasn't being supported by the physical environment. Women were coming with typically, their mother, their mother-in-law, or their sister, and they're all sitting around on the ground with all of their stuff. Nobody wanted to be in that building. And as we began talking to them, we quickly realized that, despite appearances, maternity waiting homes aren't about shelter. They're not about sleeping spaces. The real opportunity is creating community spaces where women can come together and embark on a shared collective experience of motherhood. So our question was, how can we design a maternity waiting home that encourages women to come and stay? How can it transform waiting into a positive, productive experience and not waiting? And if it's supposed to be a home, well, how can that reflect these women's personal experiences? I'll show you another video here.
Problem in Malawi is they don't have a lot of health centers, and people aggregate in villages, which are in most cases really far from hospitals or health centers. The implications of that is that mothers would travel a long distance to seek health care after they've already entered labor. And this resulted in higher mortality because they were exhausted by the time they reached the facility or they gave birth on the road. And that's the broader reason why maternity waiting homes were introduced in the country. These are places where mothers would go so they can be followed by a professional who can guide them through their last 6 weeks of pregnancy and help them deliver safely.
Of the maternity waiting homes that have been built in Malawi, usage and performance is lacking. The research suggests that even when maternity waiting homes are available to women, they may be underutilized, in part because of their design. Mothers cite concerns about the lack of privacy, safety, and hygiene. And in addition, the homes are not designed to accommodate the family members who accompany pregnant mothers during their stay. In 2013, Mass Design Group was approached to come and help rethink how these maternity waiting homes were designed. This meant that we not only had appropriate daylighting and ventilation, but we were really focusing on creating comfortable, healthy, safe, and sanitary conditions for these women. We also looked at different ways that design could facilitate interaction.
Create an experience that is going to encourage them to come back next time they get pregnant, but also encourage other mothers to go. And this entire project, since its inception, we've approached it from that angle.
So as my colleague Christian mentioned, we took our design cues from the villages around and the incredible social interactions that they supported. And we made the facility a village, and we broke up the large room into a series of small, intimate sleeping quarters, integrated spaces like cooking, spaces for socializing, and outdoor benches that at nighttime could double as sleeping spaces for the family members that were accompanying the women and had no other place to sleep. After the maternity waiting home opened in 2015, we did an impact evaluation. We basically wanted to see, was this improving user experience? So we complemented that with a series of qualitative interviews with mothers as well. And the results were published, I think, just this month in the Journal of Midwifery. But ultimately, what the evaluation showed was that the user experience in our facility compared to the standard government facility was much higher. And that was because the women didn't perceive it as a medical space. They didn't perceive it as an institution. They perceived it as a community space. And I think that's really powerful to think about when you think about beginning with a project and what it's called, and the process of having to realize what it actually is about and what it actually means. So this next project talks about how we as designers can broaden the boundaries of what a project can do and how we can seek to have impact beyond the building. I'm going to go through some of this a little quickly, but we were working with partners in health and this local Haitian nonprofit organization called Jeskio after the earthquake. And what Jeskio needed to do, here's some contextual images, and here's Dr. Pop, was think about how they could rebuild their tuberculosis facility, which fell down in the earthquake. So as I mentioned before, tuberculosis is an airborne disease. And they were housing their patients in these temporary tents. It was pretty difficult for patients. You have to spend 6 months undergoing treatment, and it's hot and it's stuffy, and it's very inhumane conditions to have to live like this. So while we were there, we worked with Jeskio to develop a design for a multi-drug resistant tuberculosis facility. I think I'm actually going to skip through this, but what I want to get through is while we were there working with them, they came to us with this other problem. They said, several months after we began working with them in the earthquake aftermath, then the Ebola outbreak happened. And so they set up temporary tents for treating patients with Ebola, and the setting was like this. It was an emergency response tactic. And they approached us saying, hey, we have this local engineer, he's designing the tents aren't working for us. We need something bigger and something a little bit sturdier than this. And they said, could you look at his designs for us and give us your feedback? And when we looked at it, we were really cautious about recommending that they go forward with that, because it was essentially a large metal facility with everybody kind of in rows. And cholera, as you can see, is an immensely undignifying and painful and horrible disease to have to go through and be treated for. And the last thing you want to do is be in a hot, stuffy metal room with tons of other people. And so we began asking this question, what could it be? If a temporary facility is only going to get so far, how can we think about what a permanent facility would be so that the facility can be there when the next outbreak happens? So I'll show you another little trailer from a video that we put together called Design That Heals.
I went into infectious diseases because I knew that they were the diseases that kill my people. I thought that this was a profession where you could actually do something.
Breaking news out of Haiti. A massive catastrophic earthquake has struck the country.
Tens of thousands of people.
A couple 100,000 dead.
All that we had done within a few seconds were destroyed.
9 months after the earthquake, a new disaster in Haiti, an epidemic of cholera.
20,000 cases nationwide.
Up to 200,000 people.
Yes, there was a big earthquake and then this cholera hit, but they were completely unrelated.
In Haiti, we need to hit cholera very hard. We need to make sure that the bacteria doesn't stay into our soil, into our water. Clearly, the infrastructure is key. There was always a sense that we could do better, to create a structure that would be adapted to the needs of the people and that would have some kind of dignity that is fully Haitian. Development does not rely only on health. Economic opportunities and education are also essential.
Ceci est une révolution, et une révolution positive.
So as Dr. Pop talked about in that clip, first we realized it can't be a temporary facility, it has to be a permanent facility. And then we realized it's not only a facility for treating cholera once people have it, we have to think about how we can break the cycle of cholera reinfection. And the problem was that groundwater, they were collecting all of the human waste from the temporary facilities in these porta potties, and those porta potties were being collected every day, taken to a dump, and just dumped without dealing with the waste properly. And that's just perpetuating the problem. It's going to reinfect more people. And so we had to think about how the cholera facility could embed in underground water treatment system so that all of the cholera waste that was being generated by the facility would come out sanitary and pure. And then on the inside, we had to think about how this could be a place that could be as dignified as possible while dealing with all of the incredible kind of sanitation and infection control considerations that we needed to take into account. So in this project, we worked not only at the building scale, but we also worked with Herman Miller to design custom cholera treatment furniture for this facility. So as I showed you in some of the previous slides, a few slides back, typically cholera furniture is just army cots with a hole cut out of the seat portion of the cot where patients can defecate through. And it's not only very uncomfortable and undignifying, but it's very ineffective and cost ineffective and just logistically ineffective, because you just cut a hole with scissors and the tarp-like material instantly frays. It's not very sterilizable, and when it frays, it rips, and because it's designed, because of the way it's designed, they have to throw the whole thing away. In this kind of emergency disaster scenario, you don't have time to go repair everything and deal with it. So it was just an incredible waste. So we worked to think about how we could create something that could be locally manufacturable and something that would work a little bit better than what they have. So this is essentially almost like a lawn chair, and when you fold the two sides together like a clamshell, and then you can pull off this sock and go and wash that, sanitize that, and kind of slide it back on. And this allows you to replace those as needed as well. So here's some views of the interior. And in my mind, alongside the immediate local impact, I think the biggest contribution of this cholera treatment facility was what it stood for and the model that it created. And that's the idea that disaster recovery infrastructure could be long-term and high quality and integrated. Here is some images of the craft that we were able to leverage. So in Haiti, they take these steel drums, they cut the tops and bottoms off and unfurl it, and they do this incredible metal work. And we were trying to think about how we could leverage that and use that craft in the building. So we worked with Jean-Baptiste. He did this incredible work, and we designed the facade almost like if you imagine like a cheese grater, so with kind of crisscross punctures, and he had all these forms for bending open those triangles at different angles, and it was all kind of modulated to provide specific lighting and ventilation openings across the building in different ways. And here are some exterior images of that. So I just showed you some images of projects that we are more known for, the work in Africa and Haiti in contexts like that. But I thought I should also share with you some of our work in the US that demonstrates ways that we're, as I mentioned, looking at impact across different scales, and specifically in healthcare. So this next example is asking the question, how can design affect how patients receive care? In 2016, we were approached by Atul Gawande's research organization. He's a surgeon and writer. He writes for The New Yorker. He has a bunch of books, but he has this incredible research organization called Ariadne. And they were really interested in this problem of unnecessary C-sections. So C-sections are actually the most common major surgery performed in the US, and they're performed on the healthiest population, for the most part, young women. And this isn't to say that C-sections are a bad thing. Often they are life-saving and often they are necessary, but often they are also unnecessary. And there was this incredible research published a few years back that looked at C-section rates between US hospitals, and the rate is all the way from 7% to 70%, and it was not able to be explained by the things that you think it might be explained by, like what women had or their social background. It was explained by the door that you walk through when you went to go give birth, and this was something that was kind of horrifying. So they were looking at how the management processes in each of these hospital spaces were affecting C-section rates. And the basic premise is that clinicians have a lot of pressure. They have time pressure, they have space pressure, et cetera. And when you have so many pressures and you have to get women through the door, you might be compelled to do a C-section to get women out of the facility faster. In the case that they're just laboring for hours and hours and hours. And so they saw a lecture by Mass, and they had this light bulb moment where they're like, we're looking at these management practices, but we have not thought about how spaces are affecting how clinicians are making decisions and giving care. So together we applied for a grant with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we proposed that design affects decisions in childbirth. Existing studies in this area around childbirth had looked at patient experience at the scale of the room, but we wanted to look at the holistic system of how things were working. So we wanted to look at provider decision-making at the whole scale of the labor and delivery unit. We looked at a range of facilities across the US, a range of different types. We documented them and had them give us a bunch of information, and we visited them in person. And we compiled these facility profiles. And ultimately, sorting our results into these 4 different categories, what we found is that design can and does influence childbirth care. So for instance, facilities with higher C-section rates tended to have greater room demand, which creates pressure on the unit, as I mentioned, greater walking distances, which adds to staff workload. When they're running between spaces and having to spend more time, there's more pressure in that way. When there's fewer collaborative spaces, that limits communication between staff, which is really important. and when there's less patient-accessible space, that discourages women from walking around, which helps natural labor progress. So that's an instance where, collecting, this was very obviously not something where we were looking at the impact of our own built projects. We are trying to ask a larger question of how does design matter, and how can we share the lessons about how it matters to others, including ourselves. This next project, which I'll end with and is a little, I think I might skip through some of these slides, it's a little long, is how can design be restorative in the largest sense of the word? So innovation doesn't only come from solving for practical needs. It also comes from thinking about how we amplify healing and amplify dignity. So Nemshaf, which is a company under Herman Miller, they're a big healthcare and office space furniture manufacturer. They approached us about designing a behavioral health furniture line, and we were really thrilled for several reasons. So first, we saw this incredible opportunity to think about this very underserved healthcare domain. So behavioral health is something that affects 1 in 4 American adults, and there's only over 6% of the population that suffers from a major mental illness. And despite a mounting need for more effective behavioral health products, this is what a lot of them look like. Our inherited facilities and inherited products contradict our desire for more integrated and restorative processes of care, and they tend to be kind of sterile and impersonal and imposing. So together with Nemshaf, we realized that developing purpose-driven behavioral health furniture that not only meets safety and durability requirements, really need to think about how it could be dignified and beautiful and restorative to have a positive impact on patient therapy. This was actually, so the other reason we were really excited is this was very aligned with some work that we had been doing around prison research with the Vera Institute of Justice. We recently completed a 1-year study with them looking at U.S. prison infrastructure, which forms a really vast network in the U.S. And the overcrowded conditions of American prisons, which are based on the premise, how can architecture punish and criminalize and warehouse humans without any considerations for their privacy or their control of their own environment, is a marked contrast against some of the more pushing the envelope examples of Scandinavian prisons, which pose a very different question, which is how can architecture contribute to the rehabilitation of inmates, not the punishment. And so what really piqued our interest was that in U.S. in U.S. prison buildings, there's very little difference between behavioral health furniture and prison furniture. Like if you cropped the photo to this portion, you would not be able to tell whether it was a behavioral health facility or a prison. And then the last reason that we were really excited to work on this project was that Nemshaf was invested in trying something that was not a typical design process. So normally in furniture, you might get handed a design brief and said, go. And they wanted to back this all up by beginning with a bunch of engagement and research to try to pose hard questions around what behavioral health furniture currently is and what it should be, and to develop a point of view around that. And then from there, think about what the products were that we think need to be designed and how we might go about establishing kind of a North Star for what those should be. So here again, we visited a range of facilities across the US and talked with a range of types of people. We did over 50 interviews and checked out furniture places and how it was working, documented it. And at the end of the day, what we found is that behavioral health furniture is actually defined by what it's not. It's defined as anti-everything. Anti-ligature, which means you can't tie anything around it and strangle yourself. Anti-contraband, which means you can't hide anything dangerous in it. Anti-flammable, anti-tamperable, anti-pickable, the list goes on. And it's not defined by anything positive about what it should do for patient therapy. So we recognized, however, that safety and durability and these kind of practical concerns were of utmost importance. And as one of our respondents said, it's going to be the leveling factor for most of the clients. But they also said that the problem here is that we're designing for these extreme conditions and the lowest common denominator, which is resulting in that chunky, plastic, uncomfortable, undignified furniture. And this isn't creating a therapeutic environment. At best, behavioral health furniture looks like this and feels like this. And sorry, did I say at best? At worst. And at best, it might have some more modern curves. It might have some poppier colors, but it's not fundamentally that different. One thing that really struck us was that while we had done this prison research, totally unprompted by us, every single one of those 50 respondents mentioned the word prison in their interview. And they talked about how prison furniture, how everything about the spaces, in a lot of cases, was very prison-like. And they also talked about how this wasn't helping. People don't get better in prisons. And I don't know that they knew this, but there is, as I mentioned, a really huge overlap between prison and behavioral health furniture. It's sometimes interchangeable for the most extreme conditions of behavioral health, which are these inpatient facilities. And so our thesis was that we needed to design not only around what furniture should prohibit, but what it should do. And here's some documentation of things that we heard that we found inspiring. So people need to be comfortable to share their stories because they're already uncomfortable with themselves. And these two pieces of furniture were not behavioral health furniture. They're old and inherited, but there were elements of them that were normalizing. There were elements of them that were familiar and soothing, like the rocking motion. And how can we translate some of these things that were kind of hand-me-downs and didn't actually meet the behavioral health regulations, but leverage that into something that was safe and durable, but had these qualities. Other things like how could we design furniture that would give agency and empower patients or make them feel less exposed and more open. And what we heard was that the physical environment absolutely is the biggest thing that affects how people feel and behave and interact. And as behavioral health, it's not like there's something that you need to physically get treated for. It's a conversation-based therapy where you need to talk to people. You need to be open. You need to be in the space of mind where you can have these heart-to-heart and very difficult conversations. And so the setting that you're in plays a big role in framing the right space for you to be able to do that. So as we progress into the design, which we're now taking on, what we're really trying to do is challenge the tensions that have been accepted by the industry as kind of unsolvable and begin to skew some of the qualities of our line over towards the right. And so I guess I just want to end with, in our work from this small school in Alima to this behavioral health furniture design for Nemshov, we found that the most valuable role that we can play as designers is not just show up with the aim of fixing visible problems. It's to begin with bold aspirations for what we're all ultimately after, and ask really hard questions. So from, can we not only build a permanent, dignified facility for treating cholera, but combine it with a wastewater treatment system for breaking the cycle of infection? To a question like, can the design of a maternity waiting home not only encourage women to come and stay, but transform waiting into a positive, productive experience and one of community? So the bigger thing that we're all after in our work is how we can leverage design to improve lives. And as we all go back to our studios and things that we have on our plate, I'd like to urge us all to broaden our aspirations for what we think that design can do and what agency and accountability we think that we have as designers, because ultimately all spaces and all forms of design can have a really deep and resonant impact beyond the building. Thanks.
We have time for a couple questions, if anybody has any.
know it's around midterms, I understand.
You get to use the mic.
So the project for the behavioral health furniture, have you finished that yet, or have you come up with any solutions yet, or is that still in the process?
We're working on it right now, top secret.
Okay.
Hopefully the line should be launched next fall though. So right now we're kind of in the middle of the design phase and figuring out materiality and all these things, but we have our general marching orders in hand.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, the work was absolutely fabulous, and I really appreciate the question that you're asking, the aspects beyond the building. So thank you for the sort of thesis and the overarching presentation. I'm really struck by, and maybe I would like to know more about it, but one of the things we study in our first year is design thinking. And it seems like Mass has done some really interesting work in integrating some of the design thinking approaches. I'm referencing maybe it's the Stanford D School, where you're posing questions, you're engaging empathetically with users, and you're taking projects in new directions. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, or if that parallel's not correct, feel free to correct me in that way as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's the design discipline has expanded and grown and deepened in a lot of ways over the last few years, and design thinking is something that is very resonant with what we do and very inspiring to what we do, and a foundation that we've built off of. And I think that Mass is, as I mentioned, a nonprofit. It's a architecture firm. It's a social justice firm. It wears a lot of different hats. And so I think if one of the foundations that we are inspired by and build off of is the kind of design thinking, human-centered design work, which began with product design and asked questions around individual end user empathy and journeys and experience, and that question around how might we kind of blend that with thinking on the kind of social impact side of things, about so what evidence exists and how can we learn from it, and how can we evaluate this and prove this with kind of architecture practice at a bigger scale than human-centered design is often applied to, and think about how we can expand normal pre-design approaches to take on some of the things that we're after and plant the seeds for or incorporate the human-centered design engagement. And then I think another foundation that we build off of is the community planning approaches and community engagement approaches that are more from like the urban planning sector. So we blend a lot of things together, and it also depends on the project, but that's definitely very aligned and very inspirational to us.
Shayla. Yeah. Maybe run this too.
So I think one of the great things about Mass is how you talk about how design dignifies and how it can bring peace. Can you touch on that a little bit more, and maybe expand on how you guys have seen your projects start to dignify people and bring peace in areas?
Yeah, I mean, taking the very first example of Butaro, we often have to continually remind ourselves that it's not only enough to think that we're doing something good. We have to raise the bar and keep the bar high, that people everywhere deserve the same high standard of excellent design, and you have to think about what that means in terms of dignity. So a couple ways that we think about dignity is dignity in the end result, creating spaces where people can feel like this place is for them, and it treats them like individuals and people, and there's a sense of meaning and place and rootedness. And you also have to think about, so one example of that in Butaro is when Butaro was being built, people asked if, who is this building for? And when they learned it's for you, it's a health center for the community, they were stunned and eventually very proud. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of ownership over the building. And in Rwanda, they have monthly days called Umuganda, where you do community service, and the building and the grounds are upkept by the community, I think partially because of that pride. And then there's also dignity in the construction process. When you are able to create jobs and create skill sets, then that gives people not only a sense of purpose and worth, but also a means of generating income beyond the project. So those stonemasons of the volcanic stone walls that I showed, that has become a kind of signature thing that they are now really sought after, and people call for them from all over Rwanda to do those stone walls. So I think that's a different take on what dignity can mean as well.
How about one more question?
So I'm interested in the designing of the process and especially the labor, and I'm wondering if you have any observations on how kind of designing the labor aspect of it might translate to a place like America, and what implications that might have.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is different here because the cost dynamics are totally inverted. So here, relatively to one another, labor is expensive and materials are cheap. And in Rwanda, labor is cheap and materials are expensive. So when we work in Rwanda, we have the ability to customize stuff, to use local labor, to try to leverage that as a way to create like as much impact as we can. And often that comes out financially savvy as well. So for example, in Butaro, it costs the same amount to hire thousands of people to dig the foundations and generate income as it would have to rent a bulldozer. But in the US, you're totally right. Like we have this, a lot of the work in Rwanda, we talk about this, our method of building as low fab or locally fabricated. In the US, we're striving to do the same thing, but it meets with different constraints. You can't insist or put upon your clients that you are going to employ thousands of people simply to generate certain opportunities and triple the cost of the building. But you can think in very targeted ways about what local craft or materials you want to embed and celebrate. And you can think about specific targeted opportunities to train particular groups of people and how that might have not only long-lasting impact, but like a deep meaning for a project. So for example, thinking if you are, how we might embed opportunities for prisoners, if you're doing something with like food justice and the justice system, or like what are the specific groups we want to target and create specific training opportunities for? What are the right moments to intervene and think about what low fab means in this setting. But you're totally right. It can't be an exact translation on let's hire 4,000 people to dig a foundation in the U.S.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.